Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, back at the desk with Niall Stanage. Niall, good morning.
Great to see you, Amber. It's been a little while since we were reunited for our Friday discussions.
Reunited, and it feels so good.
Absolutely. Ready to go for it. And we have a lot to talk about today, beginning with this. He came, he cut, he left. It's Elon Musk's last day working in the White House. While some may be grieving and others may be celebrating, President Trump is set to hold a joint press conference with Musk later today. Trump writes on Truth Social, "He will always be with us, helping all the way. Elon is terrific."
The press conference is set to take place at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, which you can watch on thehill.com. It comes after Musk has voiced criticisms of Trump's big, beautiful bill. Earlier this week, he told CBS his grievances. Let's watch.
Disappointed to see the massive spending bill, frankly, which increases the budget deficit, not just decrease it, and undermines the work that the Doge team is doing. I think a bill can be big or it can be beautiful, but I don't know if it can be both.
Musk's departure comes as the New York Times published an explosive article today outlining his alleged drug use on the campaign trail last year. The article alleges Musk frequently uses ketamine, ecstasy, psychedelic mushrooms, and Adderall. Meanwhile, some on social media are criticising Musk's work in DC. Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury, who serves as the ranking member of the Doge subcommittee, writes, "Elon Musk has exited the building, but make no mistake, this fight is not over."
Others are praising Musk's performance. Texas Senator Ted Cruz says Elon Musk spent 4 months rooting out massive waste, fraud, and abuse. The American people ought to say thank you to Elon.
Well, I'm sure we're going to have a vigorous disagreement, I suspect, on Elon Musk's role. Why don't you go first? I assume you're broadly pro-Elon?
Broadly pro. I mean, I think that he did a lot of work in exposing waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, but ultimately, if it doesn't get passed by Congress, then none of these cuts actually get made into reality. And one of the arguments from Stephen Miller, one of the top aides to President Trump, is that, well, this bill, the big beautiful bill, was focused on mandatory spending. The Doge cuts have to come through discretionary spending or a rescissions process, so that's why they're not in this bill. But I think Elon Musk is probably frustrated by the fact that he's been effectively the meat shield for Trump. He's been the guy getting the bulk of the negative opinions about the administration. His Tesla stock has been not doing well, thanks to both his role in the admin as well as the protest against Tesla. And if you're a billionaire and you're one of the richest guys in the world who wants to focus on space exploration and building electric vehicles, then you don't really need to be in an admin where maybe your efforts aren't super appreciated by Congress. And so I'm not all that surprised that he ended up dipping out.
So even though I think we probably disagree in our fundamental views of him, because I think I'm much more negative toward him than you are, I broadly agree with the argument you just made, which is that these cuts that he wishes to see enacted haven't really been enacted as yet. And there is also, of course, the question that if you really want to curb government spending to the extent that he claims you want, then actually you do need to get into things that are very sensitive, whether that's defense spending or so-called entitlement spending. That's a whole other debate. My basic view of him is that he bought influence in the government by spending so lavishly to help President Trump get elected last year. Over $250 million on that. He then is at the heart of government trying to enact these various cuts, and he also has the muscle to get regulators off his back, essentially, to get regulatory actions paused or stopped where his companies are concerned. Now, yes, I know there are rich benefactors of the Democratic Party, there are rich donors to any person running for high office in this country. But I think that Musk's spending secured him that position. I think some of the cuts have been pretty disastrous in terms of USAID, which, again, I know we disagree on. But the basic point here is he has overpromised in terms of the cuts that he initially suggested. And to my mind, he has bought himself a position where he can help his own companies by virtue of spending so much money on the president's election.
I do think it's true that he overpromised. On the point about the spending and buying the position, I mean, based on the interviews that I've seen, I do think he's sincere about this goal to cut spending. I mean, the fact that he was willing to criticize the big, beautiful bill at the expense of potentially his position in government suggests to me that there is a real motivation to impact these issues that, to me, is more important to him than the regulatory issues, because now that he hasn't been able to get those cuts codified through Congress, not only is he leaving, but he's also pulling back his spending on the Republican Party. So there's no long-term effort for him to keep this influence, which if that was the chief thing of importance to him, I think he would continue to spend, continue to try to be in Trump's good graces effectively, and instead he's been openly critical of the fact that this hasn't really gone anywhere.
I guess I'd somewhat counter that, Amber, by arguing that the reason he is departing in specific terms is because he has this special government employee status. And one of the reasons it is widely assumed he chose that kind of status is because it doesn't come with the kind of financial disclosure requirements that do come if you're a fully paid up member of the government, so to speak, if you're a cabinet secretary or something of that nature. Now, that being said, I wouldn't completely dismiss your argument about does he have a sincere belief in the cuts as well. I don't think the two things are necessarily mutually exclusive. And, you know, we do see, I feel like almost any time people talk about things like fiscal conservatism, you know, half the public falls asleep because it sounds so sort of unexciting. But it is a fact that the United States keeps adding to its debt to a very dangerous degree, is now spending more on servicing its debt, on paying the interest, essentially, than it's spending on defense, for example. And that can't continue indefinitely. And that's a rare point of agreement between myself and Elon Musk.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there was anything that was beneficial from Elon Musk's tenure, it's that he exposed government waste in a way that was very sexy, right? He was able to identify certain programs that hit on these key buzzwords like DEI or woke things or Pride months being celebrated at the FBI and things of that nature that people who voted for Trump because of some sort of cultural backlash to those ideas found really compelling. Whereas when you go back to the Tea Party, it was all about, well, Social Security is going to be insolvent. Like, yes, that's true, but it's not as exciting as we found this $30 million program that is going to, let's say, like social reorganization in foreign countries. That's a lot more exciting to just the casual observer of politics and is a really splashy headline. And so I think he kind of made government cuts cool again, in a sense.
Sure. I mean, I think he did to the Republican base, to the Trump base. I think he also incited a lot of opposition to that, which is why we see his approval ratings being, you know, worse than Trump's often. And I was looking at a poll just last night for a piece I was writing, particularly unpopular with women. I mean, like 40 points underwater. So I think there are complications to his role, but we've come to some measure of agreement, even as we disagree about his broader impact. Still ahead, Harvard President Alan Garber taking a subtle shot at President Trump. His commencement speech next.
Members of the class of 2025 from down the street, across the country, and around the world. Around the world, just as it should be.
Harvard University President Alan Garber making a jab there at President Trump's efforts to strip the Ivy League university of its ability to enroll foreign students. Within hours of those remarks from Garber, Massachusetts federal judge Alison Burroughs put a temporary injunction on that order, prohibiting the federal government from making any permanent changes to Harvard's student visa program.
But the administration says this is another case of judicial overreach. Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller even going so far as to call it a judicial coup and pointing out that this all started after the university refused to cooperate with a sprawling records request from the Department of Homeland Security. Take a listen.
Harvard defied multiple DHS subpoenas for information about its foreign students and about law-breaking and national security threats on campus. Harvard has engaged in decades of invidious, unlawful, and illegal race-based discrimination against American citizens. So Harvard is engaged in illegal and criminal conduct, and a judge is siding with Harvard's right to pad his pockets with foreign cash over the rights of American citizens and the American Constitution.
Piers Morgan ripped. Oh.
Yeah, so that's not to worry.
For later.
That's a preview of something that's
I
yet
just
to
got
come.
back from vacation, so you got to give me a break.
It's quite all right. When people will not now have their appetites whet for what we're going to say about Piers Morgan in a second.
Yeah.
What I'm going to say about Harvard is that I think that the Trump administration is using the kind of charges that Stephen Miller was making there as a way to invade and erode Harvard's academic independence. I know we'll have another difference of opinion on this one, but to my mind, first of all, Harvard, contrary to what Stephen Miller says, has in fact made efforts to provide much of the information that the government has asked for. What it has declined to do is things like, for example, comply with a request to get any information of international students participating in protests at all, not acts of criminality, not illegal protests, but they were asked to provide any video or audio of any protests that international students were involved in. They're not going to do that. The other point about the Trump administration and its requests is that it involves or includes a audit or the request for audits of Harvard departments where the government would approve the auditor. Harvard, rightly, in my view, isn't going to concede that point because it sees it as the government getting its fingers into academic freedom and eroding that freedom.
Yeah, I'm less excited about the Trump administration's attacks on the international students and their right to be involved in protests. I mean, I think in some of the cases you had individuals who were expressing quite extreme ideas that were counter to American national security and foreign policy, which is understandable that if you are inviting someone to come study in your country, you don't want someone who is going to come in and cause chaos. But what I think is the stronger point for the Trump administration is that Harvard for a long time was violating basic civil rights through affirmative action and employment, through Title VII, and then through Title IX with both the inclusion of gender ideology as a protected category in addition to sex, as well as affirmative action admissions programs. Now, obviously, the admissions programs were struck down by that Supreme Court case with Students for Fair Admissions, but Harvard tried to intentionally work around that legal barring by deciding to have students write impact statements where they were encouraged to write about things like race and identity. So it was a way of getting students to tell them what their race was without just checking a box on an application and being able to consider that in the admissions process. And they still continue to use affirmative action for hiring. So for me, the reason for pulling the funding from Harvard should be predicated on the fact that they are openly violating federal law as it relates to anti-discrimination metrics. But then when you get into the international students and pulling their visas, this is obviously a sort of additional punishment on top of pulling the grants, pulling the federal funding away from the university to try to get them to comply with those requests from the Trump administration, or demands, I guess you could say, from the Trump administration. And one of the things that I always find really interesting about the debate about international students is that it's sort of predicated on this idea that the reason that international students have to come study at Harvard or other U.S. universities is because we're getting the best and brightest from around the world. But I think in practice, that's not really how it works. The reason that universities like to have international students come study is that typically they're paying full sticker price for tuition. So they like to have international students to subsidize the financial aid, grants, scholarships that are going to American students. And if you're purely financially motivated to bring international students in, particularly Chinese students, because you don't want to have to pay out of your own coffers to have American students who are the best and brightest to come study there, then that's a problem for me. And to me, that's the key argument for why the Trump administration should have some kind of restrictions on how many of those students are actually allowed to come here.
So first of all, on the affirmative action question, I'm not in as total opposition to your position, as you might expect. I do think that if you look at Harvard's admission rates when they are broken down by race and academic percentile, that there are rather pressing questions there about whether there is, in effect, I mean, the whole charge of anti-white discrimination can be kind of a bit toxic at times, or can sound a bit toxic. It is certainly the case that Asian Americans have a case to make there also, that their admittance rates are unfairly kept low in pursuit of diversity. Now, in relation to the impact statement part, I have a more generous view of that than you do, I think, because I think it is acceptable and indeed desirable to have people communicate something about the totality of their experiences, because we don't in fact all start from a level playing field, and the unlevel parts of it can be to do with race or class or lots of other circumstances in people's lives. So I don't really object to that. On the point about international students, Amber, yes, I do agree that they are broadly financially advantageous to the colleges and universities, and that financial advantage can often be utilized to subsidize the education of American students. I don't really have a problem with that. I think that is advantageous both ways. I don't see that as a zero-sum game. And I don't really think it's fair to suggest that the people are not the best and brightest. It seems a logical fallacy to me to say because they're paying full sticker price, they're not the best and brightest. Like, that's not necessarily the case at all. If somebody wants to traverse the world from India or China or Taiwan, some of those big feeder countries for American universities, it's generally because they are extremely bright, and it's very rarely, incidentally, because they're wanting to pursue the kind of courses that outrage many conservatives. It's often because they want to further their own education in STEM kind of subjects.
Yeah, but I think the point where it's because it's not fallacious, because if you were purely seeking the best and brightest international students, then surely there would be some who are coming from poor circumstances, need some kind of financial assistance, and yet we see in the vast majority of cases, if not all of them, that students are paying full price. So I just find it very unlikely that all of the best and brightest international students are also the ones who are able to pay their full way, right? I'd also find Trump's comments about the remedial math course they've had at Harvard quite compelling. I mean, the idea that you have to teach your Harvard students basic algebra is a further indication that they're not admitting the best and brightest students, because if they were, then surely they'd have people who had completed some higher level of at least algebra 2, maybe calculus, right? Maybe an AP calculus course. So that's very concerning to me that their academic standards have dropped so much, apparently. And sure, like, there's a public school system issue here, but it's hard to imagine that you couldn't find enough students to fill Harvard that have some level of English and math excellence.
Proficiency, yeah. And I think there's also part of the argument there about standards declining because of COVID, school closures and all of that. I do want to make one very final point, because I know we're running long, because it's an interesting topic, but you mentioned this being part of the broader sort of, well, you wouldn't use the word assault on Harvard, but I will, the kind of attack on Harvard and the pulling of the grants and all of that. I do find that very self-defeating for the United States, and this does get to the best and brightest argument. The pulling of grants from an elite university like that is in fact handicapping research projects that could benefit the nation as a whole, and is making a less appealing atmosphere in the United States for leading scientists and researchers. And, you know, while Trump is talking about pulling grants, what's happening in places like Europe, for example, they're delighted about this and are putting their own schemes in place. The European Commission wanting to spend 500 million euro in the next 3 years to try to lure scientists to Western Europe. So that's my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely an argument to have a certain level of international visas available for students. And look, other universities are still getting them, right? This is specific to Harvard because they've refused to comply with federal law. But on the the point that Secretary of State Marco Rubio was making yesterday about Chinese students, where it's a full ban, I think that's more compelling to me because the CCP does have a lot of control over what those students do, where they go, what they study, whether they get to come back to China to see their family or not. And there's been a lot of indictments over the past 10 years of both professors and researchers stealing research and intellectual property and sending it back to the CCP. So that's a legitimate concern because there's the spying element involved.
I'm always admiring of your research, and I am not expert on exactly the circumstances around Chinese students and their links to the CCP. So I'll give you that one.
Thank you. The tease I was supposed to read is now here. Piers Morgan ripped into the Israeli ambassador to the UK over the war in Gaza, and that is next on Rising.
Do you know how many Hamas terrorists you've killed and how many children you've killed? Do you know there's two numbers?
I know the numbers that came from the IDF. We never target civilians, so this question is irrelevant.
How many children have you killed?
Piers, Israel is not killing children. Israel is not killing children. Hamas is using them as human shields.
Israel is killing children every single day.
Piers, this is a blood label you're putting on Israel. You know it's not true.
No, it's not actually. And what you're trying to do is be very weaselly with your words.
Piers Morgan, of all people, confronting Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom there over the number of casualties in the war in Gaza. It's an apparent 180 for Morgan, who, by his own admission, spent months after the October 7th attacks defending the Israeli government and promoting Israel's right to defend itself. Morgan repeatedly pushed the ambassador to give a hard number for children killed by Israel in Gaza during the war, and criticised the Israeli government for refusing to allow foreign journalists into Gaza, a move that the ambassador said was for their own safety.
We are coming to the point where journalists will be allowed to get into Gaza as long as there is no risk for them. And you know that...
It's got nothing to do with you, the risk to journalists.
It's
not your problem.
From my point of view...
It's not your problem.
Once there is no risk to their life, I'm sure they'll be allowed to get in.
Oh, what a load of flannel, Ambassador. Don't treat us like idiots, please. We're not idiots. You're not doing it for our safety. You've banned the journalists so that they don't report on what is actually happening.
It comes as Trump's negotiations between Israel and Hamas continue. Just yesterday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that Israel backed and supported a new ceasefire proposal from U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff. But The Economist reports Israel is gearing up to launch the main phase of a new campaign in Gaza with the goal of eradicating Hamas once and for all. Host of the Mark Levin Show took to X to express his support, saying in part, quote, "Why is the United States dictating to Israel how to fight Hamas?" He continued, "Israel wants to destroy Hamas. We keep demanding a ceasefire, which is what the Biden regime did. Why are we not allowing Israel to handle this instead of prolonging the war? Israel knows what to do and how to do it."
Well, I am on Piers Morgan's side on this one, which won't surprise you. But I do think, what one thinks of Piers Morgan is kind of beside the point. To his credit, I think that kind of questioning of representatives of the Israeli government is well overdue. And I was glad to see him do it. And I was also glad to see at a separate point from the one we played, where he was talking about the deaths of children, and the ambassador, shot back that it was a blood libel, implying that it was anti-Semitic. And he pushed back very strongly against that. So look, I have criticised numerous times what I think is Israel's grossly disproportionate response to what was admittedly a completely heinous attack on October 7th. I think it's blatantly engaged in war crimes. I think that is increasingly becoming a somewhat mainstream view. Ehud Olmert, the former Prime Minister of Israel, said as much just this past week. Israeli newspapers are saying it. Doctors are saying it. Anyway, I think it's disgraceful. But I thought Piers Morgan did his job well.
Yeah, I thought he did. And I think any journalist who interviews a member of the Israeli government should be willing to ask challenging questions. And it's unfortunate that there's been this really aggressive posturing towards the Palestinian narrative or members of the pro-Palestinian side, but not so much the Israeli government. And I think it's incumbent on a journalist to make sure that both sides of a war are being questioned aggressively in that way. And so I appreciate what Piers Morgan did there. And I think it's become increasingly clear that the reason the war has been drawn out this long is not because there's this intrinsic interest of just decimating Gaza necessarily. That's part of it. But the other part of it is that Benjamin Netanyahu retains a significant amount of political power if they continue the war, right? He has an interest in staying in as the leader of Israel, and if he leaves office, could potentially be prosecuted for some corruption crimes. And so he wants to hold on to that as long as possible, and being able to gin up support for a continued affront against Gaza is precisely how he keeps on hanging on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I think that kind of point isn't really explored enough here, because oftentimes the debates get stuck in this sense that as soon as you express sympathy for the Palestinians, you're anti-Israel. And that does not acknowledge at all the kind of motivations for Benjamin Netanyahu that you refer to, nor does it acknowledge at all that this is by far the most right-wing government in Israel's history, and includes people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was convicted in Israeli courts of supporting terrorism, includes people like Bezalel Smotrich, who would have 10 years ago been considered way beyond the pale to participate in an Israeli government. So this at least should be about criticisms of policy and of individual politicians and their views. I do agree that on the extremes of both sides, you have people who are in some cases anti-Semitic, or who are in some cases anti-Islam or anti-Arab, and are speaking from a place of prejudice. I don't think it is at all fair to smear criticisms of what Netanyahu has done or what this government has done with the term of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are extreme elements of the pro-Palestinian side. We saw this with the murder of two individuals outside of that Israeli party in Washington, D.C., but to conflate every criticism of Israel with being anti-Semitic, it has been a constant theme of the past year and a half when discussing the conflict, which is unfortunate because then you don't really get at the heart of the issue, and you don't allow people to have this vigorous debate the way that they should have. The Daily Callers are working on an interesting piece where we've been talking to the Arab Americans who pushed against Kamala Harris's path to the presidency and in a way helped get Trump elected. And they've been saying, well, we don't really regret that because actually the posture of the Trump administration has been a little bit more skeptical of Israel than a continuation of the Biden administration might have been, and Kamala did not separate herself from Biden on that topic. One of the key points to that is with the remaining American hostage that was being held by Hamas in Gaza, Israel wasn't involved in that negotiation, right? Hamas apparently reached out to Arab Americans for Trump, who then reached out to the Trump administration, and they were able to negotiate that hostage release directly with Hamas. And Israel, of course, was upset about it because they found out by spying, which is classic. But okay, you could be mad about it, but did you get the hostage home, right? Did you do anything to effectuate the return of the American hostage, or has the U.S. actually been advancing all of these negotiations as you've sort of dug in and refused to really concede anything in these negotiations? And so I thought that was a really great development by the Trump administration to say, we're going to do what's in the best interest of our country, of our people, and if that doesn't involve Israel, then that's really too bad.
So let me bridge the kind of partisan divide, because although I sit in this seat, I have been and would continue to be extremely critical of the Biden administration's conduct in that part of the world. I think it was honestly a moral disgrace, and I think not only former President Biden, but a lot of these guys like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, who are sort of revered in a sense at least by a liberal or democratic-leaning foreign policy establishment, really need to answer for their actions in a big way in that respect. In relation to Trump, I guess my one counter to the valid points that you raised was his endorsement or his openness to what I consider just ethnic cleansing, this idea that you're going to convert Gaza into some sort of tourist resort and shunt the people for whom it is their home out of there. I find that, I disagree with it strongly, and I find it quite offensive. That is not to deny that at times he has displayed greater skepticism toward Netanyahu, and in fact at the very start of Trump's second term did press the Israelis in a way that Biden had signally failed to do, to sign up to a ceasefire. Now, this was going to breach that ceasefire, but the pressure was there from the Trump side, and I think that was valid and fair pressure.
Yeah, there's recent reports as well that he's been increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu and has kind of isolated him from these conversations to an extent, which obviously needs to happen if you are going to reach some kind of ceasefire agreement in this war, because he's been completely unwilling to this point to take that seriously at all.
Absolutely, no, agree with that. Still ahead on rising, the Trump administration supercharging its deportation efforts. There's a new daily arrest minimum for ICE. We'll discuss that next. Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller and Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem are supercharging the number of arrests of immigrants living in the U.S. illegally.
According to Axios, the two are demanding that ICE set a goal of 3,000 arrests per day, triple the number of daily arrests in the first few weeks of Trump's second term. Here's Miller on Fox Thursday.
We can't take the risk of letting these Biden illegals roam around freely so that the next American daughter can get raped, the next American kid can get murdered, the next American family can get splintered and torn apart by people that came into this country unchecked, uncontrolled, unvetted, uninvited by the American people.
ICE already has nearly 49,000 people in custody. In the big, beautiful bill passed earlier this week, House Republicans gave DHS another $147 billion over the next 10 years to fund the mass deportation efforts. ICE has also requested additional staffing, bed space, and resources to hit that target.
Immigration advocates say that more arrests will likely lead to more people wrongfully detained and possibly deported. The push for more deportations comes as Trump was dealt a legal blow Wednesday, when a judge ruled that the administration's bid to deport former Columbia University student Mahmoud Khalil is likely unconstitutional. The administration is trying to deport Khalil using a provision of immigration law that allows the Secretary of State to deport any non-citizen who is deemed to be adverse to American foreign policy interests. The judge ruled that the provision was too vague, saying people like Khalil would have no way of knowing what might get them deported. I think probably the targets for immigration arrests is the best place to start. We could come on to Mahmoud Khalil in a second. What do you make of this 3,000 arrests a day figure?
It seems pretty lofty, but I think when you have the goal of getting rid of 20 million illegal aliens, then it makes sense that you have to speed things up a little bit. A few hundred a day is obviously not going to get them to reach that goal in the 4 years of the Trump administration. So I'm supportive of it. I think it's great that they're putting the pressure on. The question then is, do they have the funding available to do it? And do they have basically the strategy available to do it? Is ICE, or is DOJ, is DHS capable of actually finding these people in a timely manner and getting to that number of arrests? And that I'm not sure of.
Right, and also finding the right people and not picking up the wrong people as well, right? I mean, this is where the danger arises. I am not on the immigration issue as far to the left as a lot of people in the Democratic Party are, and sometimes the media coverage perplexes me. There was a front page New York Times story earlier this week about a woman, a Venezuelan woman and her 2 children who had decided to return to Venezuela. I'm not quite sure what the problem is with that, although it was certainly the purpose of putting it on the front page of the New York Times was to suggest that it was a big problem. I mean, the woman acknowledged that she was here illegally. She had decided to return to Venezuela rather than remain here. Where I have had the objection, and I think you and I have debated it before, is on things like the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, which I consider the Trump administration to have acted lawlessly on. Here, in terms of the targets and the putting a number on the people who, ICE is supposed to arrest, I do think that if they are not sufficiently resourced, and if their information is not good enough, it can lead to genuine dangers for American citizens. And we've had instances of this. I mean, it took me 5 minutes to find several instances, like a 19-year-old with learning difficulties by the name of Jose Hermosilla, who was detained for nearly 10 days near Tucson. Another man with dual citizenship detained for nearly 48 hours in Florida. These are people who are American citizens, are being picked up, yes, ultimately released, but having undergone terribly heavy-handed treatment wrongfully.
Yeah, I do think that there should be some on-ramp of due process where people are able to prove that they are who the government says they are, or that they aren't who the government says they are, and that they are in the U.S. legally or illegally. I mean, I think everybody agrees with that. On your point about those headlines about the people being deported and their kids going with them, those are quite troubling because they imply that the children themselves, who are American citizens, were deported. But of course, it was a case of the family wanting the kids to come with them, which I think is
understandable,
right?
Yeah,
like,
right.
is it? I mean, if the Trump administration said no, your kids have to stay here because they're American, I think people would be rightfully outraged that they don't get to go with the mother. There was another case earlier this week where an Australian woman who's married to an army soldier in Hawaii claimed that she was wrongfully detained at the airport and then sent back to Australia when she was just trying to visit her husband. And then when the full case file came out, it turned out that she was traveling with like 3 or 4 suitcases, including one that was just full of cookware, and that she had met her husband on a previous trip to Hawaii where she was with a boyfriend, broke up with the boyfriend, got married to the U.S. Army soldier like a month later. And so it was pretty obvious based on the facts of the case that she was trying to go to Hawaii to live with him, and she had brought on all these things to make up their house. And it's like, okay, maybe you didn't tell the full story, lady, which is kind of common where news outlets are like, oh my gosh, this woman was wrongfully deported, and then you hear more of the story and you're like, okay, maybe that's not exactly what happened. But yeah, to get to your point, like, there should be due process. People should get a chance to say, I'm not that person that you're claiming that I am. But if an immigration court finds the facts compelling and it is determined that person is in the U.S. illegally, then I think they should be rapidly removed.
Mm-hmm. So to give our audience a brief peek behind the scenes, you had suggested the story about the woman in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's a very liberal sounding story for Amber to be suggesting.
I was trying to set you up.
Exactly. You were trying to lull me into a false sense of security to defend that woman and then be like, well, you see. So look, I mean, I think that obviously if there are issues like that where it's plainly against the law to get married, purely for green card purposes and all of that sort of thing. I don't know the particulars of that case. I assume she denies that was her intention.
Oh, of course.
We always give people due process here. I mean, I think that, there are, to my mind, 2 separate points. There is, should people who are here illegally have to leave? And the answer to that largely seems to me to be yes, unless there are very obvious and serious extenuating circumstances. Then there is a separate due process point about things like the mistaken identity we talked about, and also just the fact that, for example, some of the deportations to El Salvador, we still don't really know what the basis for those, in fact, was. There are lots of things claimed that have not been verified, nor have we seen the counter-arguments from the people involved. There are still people who have not been officially identified who are now in some prison in El Salvador. So I have much more of a problem with that, and I've much more of a skepticism or suspicion of the Trump administration in that regard than you do. There we are.
Yeah, but I thought that the Supreme Court's initial ruling on the Alien Enemies Act, which is, again, you have to give the person the opportunity to defend themselves against the charges, or at least say that they're not who the government says they are. I think having that standard before the removal to El Salvador is fine, and that probably should be the standard for all of the deportations. But then to say that they're not allowed to use that act at all was where I was like, okay, now I think it's gone too far.
Yeah, and well, I mean, we could get into a whole big debate about that.
Yeah.
The Alien Enemies Act is predicated on the idea that a foreign government is involved in in invading the United States. The Trump administration argues that the government of Venezuela is doing that. I think that's a spurious allegation. I assume you think it is more credible. We will have to agree to disagree, I think, on that one. President Trump wants a lot more from Paramount than their $15 million offer to settle the 60 Minutes lawsuit. We'll discuss that next.
Anger and frustration are mounting after President Trump reportedly declined Paramount's offer to settle the $20 billion CBS 60 Minutes lawsuit. Paramount was prepared to cough up $15 million, according to an exclusive Wall Street Journal story. Trump's team wants them to bring more than $25 million to the table, along with an apology, or it's no deal.
To make matters worse, media advocacy group Freedom of the Press is threatening to sue Paramount and its chair, Shari Redstone, if they settle. The group sent Redstone a warning letter, even as she is in the middle of trying to push through an $8 billion merger with Skydance Media. The group writes, corporations that own news outlets should not be in the business of settling baseless lawsuits that clearly violate the First Amendment.
As a reminder, President Trump is suing CBS over their 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris, which he says was deceptively edited. CBS has firmly denied the allegations, but fallout from the lawsuit has caused multiple people at the company to step down from their roles.
Some social media users are up in arms over the proposal of a settlement. Co-founder of Indivisible, Ezra Levin, writes, when you cower to a bully, you teach the bully to bully you more. Also, the 12 people with Paramount Plus subscriptions should cancel those. Senior fellow at the American Immigration Council, Aaron Recklin-Melnick, says, pathetic stuff, just pathetic. I suspect this may be our most vigorous segment of disagreement here today, Amber, because I do regard Trump's suit against Paramount for this as fairly absurd and intimidatory. I will just say flat out that I think the narrative around the 60 Minutes interview is wrong. I don't think that 60 Minutes did anything wrong. I think they pruned or clipped an answer to condense it. I do not think they changed Kamala Harris's meaning. I don't think they left out anything that would have embarrassed her. I see some, I don't know how people come to this conclusion, claims that the answers were pasted together from other parts of the interview. If you look at the transcript, that isn't what happened. The answers were shortened in a completely standard journalistic practice.
I do think it would have embarrassed her to have the full clip appear as opposed to the shortened version, because you see her stumbling over her words, kind of struggling to find the answer that she's trying to convey, and it obviously fed into this idea that Kamala Harris was an empty suit, that she didn't have the capability of speaking well publicly, that she wasn't able to speak in depth about certain policy issues.
I don't want to interrupt the flow of your argument. I just don't agree with that characterization. I think that it is a slightly verbose, slightly hesitant answer. If you wanted to find, because this is not to be just like, yay, Kamala's great. If you wanted to find instances of her being inarticulate, you could easily find 10 or 20 that were much worse than that. Anyway.
So she has a lot of them.
Yeah, but I just don't think that was an intention intended to conceal a particularly damaging answer.
Well,
anyway,
I think the lawsuit is intended to find out, right? I actually don't think the Trump administration has any sense that they would actually win a suit if they were going to go to trial. This isn't even really a defamation case. This is a news distortion case, which is pretty difficult to prove in and of itself. CBS, of course, has a broadcast license, which the FCC is also looking into. But I think this is about discovery. And the Trump team wants to go into discovery to see if they can find CBS editors, producers, perhaps higher up senior executives making a decision to edit that clip for political purposes. That's what they're trying to suss out. And CBS and Paramount obviously don't want to go to discovery we talked about this a few weeks ago, the same reason Fox didn't want to go into discovery for the Dominion lawsuit. So I think that's why they're trying to settle this case. It's not because they think they would lose the lawsuit, but they don't want emails, text messages that could be potentially embarrassing to the company, even if they don't have anything specifically to do with editing of that clip to get out there. So I actually think the Trump administration, or the Trump team rather, is doing this because they want to find some compromise that proves their claims about liberal media bias.
We even disagree on the motivations of each side here, Amber, because I don't see Paramount's motivation in offering a settlement to this to be the avoidance of discovery. I consider Paramount's motivation to be pretty plainly expediting this merger with Skydance.
Oh yeah, I think it's 50-50. Yeah.
And the merger with Skydance requires federal approval, and so that's why Shari Redstone in particular appears loath to get crosswise with Trump, because he and his administration would have the capacity to block the merger. And I think that is a really clear problem. And I find the legal, or the threat of suing from the Free Speech or Freedom of the Press organization that we quoted, I do think that's really interesting, because their argument is, in essence, that if Paramount paid 15 million or 25 million to settle this case, which in my view, that organization rightly sees as a baseless claim on Trump's part, that it would in effect amount to de facto bribery, because it would be paying Trump off to not block a merger. Now, obviously I have no idea if that claim would prevail in the courts, but I do think it serves at least as a counterweight to this rather craven possibility of Paramount surrendering, having done nothing wrong.
I thought the ABC lawsuit against George Stephanopoulos was an obviously stronger case for the Trump team, because they had George Stephanopoulos saying on air that Trump had been found liable for rape, which was, I mean, I guess at best you could argue the judge sort of post-decision made a claim like that, but it wasn't what was actually found through the judgment. And so for them to settle that, I thought was wise, because I didn't think they would do well in trial. This one to me is more spurious, and I think we agree on that.
Yeah, we do. The ABC one was about the differentiation between sexual abuse, of which Trump was found civilly liable, and rape, of which he wasn't. And then, as you say, the judge afterwards sort of said, well, it amounts to the same thing because of specifics of a New York law. And I didn't think Stephanopoulos should have said what it was George Stephanopoulos, I'm not sure if we mentioned that, made the charge, and I think that was not very wise. This one, I do totally agree, is more spurious, and I think that it is very dangerous to see an organization that is so big and influential, and 60 Minutes for all that the media has changed is still a big, a widely viewed program in this country, and I think it would be terrible if they bent the knee for having done, in my opinion, nothing wrong. We shall see.
Next up, President Trump says he's thinking about pardoning the group of men who were charged with plotting to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. President Trump said this week that he'll consider pardoning the men charged with plotting to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
Here's Trump on Wednesday.
Question.
President Muhammad,
yeah, go ahead, please.
Will you pardon the people who are accused of conspiring to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer?
I'm going to look at it. I will take a look at it. It's been brought to my attention. I did watch the trial. It looked to me like somewhat of a railroad job. I'll be honest with you. It looked to me like some people said some stupid things. You know, they were drinking, and I think they said stupid things. But I'll take a look at that. And a lot of people are asking me that question from both sides, actually. A lot of people think they got railroaded. A lot of people think they got railroaded. And probably some people don't. One more. Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
Whitmer responded yesterday to Trump's thoughts on the matter. Here she is.
Well, you know, I'm very disappointed that they're even considering it, frankly. You know, when the president was shot at in Pennsylvania, I was one of the first people on either side of the aisle to condemn it. We have to condemn political violence, no matter where it comes from, no matter who it's aimed at.
Two men, Adam Fox and Barry Croft Jr., were among those convicted in the plot. Court documents say the plotters were angry about Governor Whitmer's COVID-19 restrictions and planned to take her from her vacation home.
There's one aspect in this case that has raised some questions, however. As the New York Times reported in 2022, defense filings show that the FBI deployed at least 12 informants and several undercover agents during the debacle. The defense argued that these undercover informants and agents entrapped Croft and Fox.
But a federal appeals court upheld Fox and Croft's convictions earlier this year. The two had claimed the trial judge prevented them from using an entrapment defense. Interesting case, this one, Amber. There was fairly widespread use of informants in this case, as you suggested. I, as a general matter, always think that raises like legitimate ethical concerns as well as concerns about the ultimate finding in the trial. In this case, I think that these guys were guilty, as has been upheld on appeal, and I am not at all persuaded by any evidence that I have seen that the actions of informants were the catalyst that got these guys over the line into illegality. And this did come up when they appealed the decision, and a government lawyer in that appeal talked about Mr. Fox saying that he said we need to take our tyrants hostages before he had ever met a government informant. And Barry Croft had been saying the same thing for much longer. So I would argue that although the use of informants is often ethically complicated, there was genuine, I mean, these guys were involved in a militia that was doing training exercises and other things. There had been an armed protest in the Michigan state capitol, I believe. I think when there's a threat like that, police and law enforcement have to figure out what to do about it, and I don't really see this as some giant miscarriage of justice.
I think at best you could say that these individuals were popping off with generalities about distaste for government officials, but it was really the FBI informants, and I'm loath to even call them that because in this case they really did drive the entirety of the plot. They were the ones who actually gathered these separate individuals together into a group that then they then created a Facebook page for it called the Michigan 3%ers and dubbed Adam Fox the new leader of that group. The FBI informants were getting paid tens of thousands of dollars and being encouraged by their handlers to push these people along to the idea of killing or kidnapping specific government officials. So after their initial meeting, which the FBI informants orchestrated, they were the ones who encouraged them to go to that protest at the state capitol. And in fact, when they showed up, it was the FBI handlers who told the police at the Michigan State Capitol to stand down and allow them to go inside to give the impression that they were there to do some kind of armed takeover. Then you fast forward, and in the text messages and in the testimony from the FBI informants, during the court trials of these individuals, they admit that they were the ones who first brought up the idea of kidnapping the Michigan governor. At first, all of the other people in the group who were not FBI informants said that they didn't want to do that they didn't like the idea, that they didn't want to hurt anybody, they just wanted a constitutional republic. The FBI informants kept pushing, and apparently it got so distasteful to the members of the group that in August, before the plot was attempted to be carried out, the group started to disband. And the FBI informant who went by Big Dan was again told by his handler, you have to make sure that these people don't separate, that we get them back together and we carry this out to the end. So Big Dan again orchestrates some big meeting for these guys to get back together and starts driving them to the governor's vacation home, which he suggested as the kidnapping spot. They had another FBI informant on the bridge where boats could come in and out to see if police would be able to respond there. A second FBI informant decides to show the group a video of him carrying out a bombing of a vehicle to prove that he would be able to bomb the bridge to prevent police from getting to the home if some alarm were triggered, and telling them that he had the money to pay for all of the explosives. And it was only after all of that that these individuals were picked up and indicted by the FBI. So I think it's one thing to have an FBI informant sitting in on a group and listening to people and following them as they are engaging in these actions. It's another thing for them to suggest crimes, to drive people, to encourage the planning of a crime. And so the fact that this was almost entirely driven and advanced by the FBI informants is what makes this, I think, reasonable for Trump to consider pardoning them.
I think that where we disagree, it seems to me, at the core of the issue is the extent to which you say it was driven by FBI informants. I would argue that that's not the case. I mean, you have characterized a lot of it there in terms that, obviously support your interpretation. I would argue that these guys, particularly Fox and Croft, because it is worth noting that there were people acquitted in this case, right? There were, I believe, 14 people were originally charged. There were 9 people either convicted or pleaded guilty, and 5 were acquitted.
Yeah, and Fox and Croft initially had a mistrial, and then they brought the charges again.
They brought the charges again, and they were convicted. And then they sought to appeal, claiming that they were not allowed to raise these issues of entrapment, and the convictions were upheld.
Which is true, because they were not allowed to include the prosecution showed their text messages, but the defense was excluded from showing the text messages in response from the FBI informants and from showing the text messages from the FBI handlers.
But the point I would make is that the intent, in my view, from those 2 guys in particular, was already threatening to Gretchen Whitmer and was already antagonistic to, not just to her policies, but it's not as if these guys are some sort of vaguely dissatisfied right-wing guys who were lured in my opinion, by informants. They had the impulses or the desire to do these things. There was then an argument about to what extent informants, I think you used the phrase, sped the process on or not. I don't share your characterization of those events, and I think that's why the convictions in these cases were not just found by a jury in the first place, but were upheld.
Well, Big Dan did testify in court, though, that he was the one who first asked for the plan and came up with the idea of kidnapping Gretchen Whitmer. Adam Fox, before he was brought into this group of disparate people that were identified as the FBI as potentially becoming extremists, was living in the basement of a vacuum cleaner shop, had no money to his name, to the point that he had to go to a Mexican restaurant next door to brush his teeth and wash his face. The FBI informant Big Dan had on multiple occasions offered him credit cards and gift cards that he could use to buy weapons and ammunition to take on government officials, and every single time he declined. And both he and other members of the group, after the first several times the kidnapping plot was brought up, said, we don't want to do that. And yet the FBI kept pushing, not to mention the handler in this case, who was responsible for Big Dan, broke FBI protocol because he had a security company on the side where he was posting private information about the upcoming arrest in a Facebook group to promote his security company. So there was a vested interest by the FBI handlers and informants in this case to make sure that they were keeping this group together and pushing them to try to commit some type of act of domestic terrorism or extremism, even despite their initial reluctance and unwillingness to do it. So you kind of go from people who were expressing things that frankly were similar to left-wing chats about the guy who killed the 2 people outside of the Jewish event, talking about we need to genocide the white people. And it's like, would I have supported the FBI picking that guy up over that? No, because people in private chats all the time say things that sound extreme because they're venting. But the only time that a specific plan was created, it was spurred by the FBI informants creating the plan first and then dragging these other guys along with them.
But the reason the FBI informants were part of the picture to start off with was because these guys had set up not the 3%ers, but a separate militia, the Wolverine, the second word's escaping me at the moment. But it is not, I do think that it's not quite fair to characterize this just as people saying inflammatory things or having extreme political opinions. Extreme political opinions are, generally speaking, protected speech. The reasons these guys came to the attention of the FBI in the first place was that prior to any informants being turned or inserted into that organization appeared to be gearing up for actual action of some kind, which is why I would say, regardless of whether that was on the left or the right, those kind of plans do rightfully draw law enforcement attention as to how they can be scrutinized or surveilled or otherwise disrupted.
Right, but there was no specific plan, which is exactly the point. They had people basically playing around with guns and cosplaying as a militia, and it's, I think, very reasonable to say that there would have never been an attempt to kidnap the Michigan governor unless the FBI informants had been involved in it. So if you thought that these guys were potentially going to become radicalized or already were, and were going to create a plot to do something bad, to do something violent, then okay, have an FBI agent watch them, have them report back to their handlers about what these guys are saying. But it is not appropriate for the FBI to, out of whole cloth, come up with a plot and then tell these guys, I've got the money to do it, I've got the resources to do it. I know you said you don't want to, but come back in, these are your brothers, these are your friends, and actually provide the specifics, the details of the supposed plan that the militia was going to do anyway.
Setting aside that specific debate, which we could continue having about how exactly to characterize their actions, would you not think that the proper remedy, if let's posit that your interpretation is correct, is the remedy not in the courts rather than a presidential pardon then?
Well, I mean, ideally, the courts would have found these guys not guilty, but
they didn't.
But they didn't, right? And so that's what the presidential pardon is for. Is when you think the justice system got it wrong, that's an executive power remedy to fix it.
But your argument is that there has been a miscarriage of justice, right?
Yes, I think so.
And that is something that I think it benefits more from going through the appellate process rather than just having a president come in and going, okay, that's done.
I mean, that would be ideal, but it doesn't always work that way, does it, right? Like, you can make the same argument for the people that Joe Biden pardoned for low-level marijuana offenses. You could say, yes, based on the law, those people committed a crime and they are serving sentences that are laid out by federal law, right? But then Joe Biden has the right to say, I think that that law is unjust, and so I'm going to provide them with a pardon.
Yes, but we're probably going to have to go here. But Biden's argument there is that the law is unjust. That's separate, it seems to me, from saying the law is valid and those people were wrongfully convicted. You don't understand the distinction?
Well, I do, but I think in this case, the miscarriage of justice was the fact that they were not allowed to present certain evidence in their defense on the entrapment point. And that really is the underlying argument as to why these guys were wrongfully convicted, is that they were not able to present the proper defense in order to hold the FBI accountable for what they did.
Fair enough. I'll let you have the last word.
I appreciate that, as always. FBI Director Kash Patel takes a swipe at James Comey. That's next.
He wants to come after me, no problem. I've been living rent-free in that guy's head for years, and that's just a bonus.
That was FBI Director Kash Patel taking a swipe at his predecessor, James Comey, who criticized the new agency's leader in a CNN interview on Thursday. Speaking with Fox News' Brett Baer on Special Report later in the day, Patel pushed back on Comey's criticism about his leadership and Comey's now infamous beach walk. Take a look.
James Comey's a private citizen, and he can walk around the beach and talk about seashells and Crayola crayons for all I care about, and talk about how we're the conspiracy theorists. But I just remind the American people of one thing. When that man was a leader of the FBI, he perpetrated the largest criminal conspiracy, packaged political information from overseas, took it to a federal FISA court, and illegally surveilled a political opponent. So I won't be lectured on how to run this FBI from that man.
Speaking with CNN's Wolf Blitzer, Comey called out the FBI's effort to investigate, quote, potential public corruption, including cocaine found at the White House, the pipe bomb placed near the DNC and RNC headquarters ahead of January the 6th, and the leaked drafts of the Supreme Court Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. Let's watch.
I'm sure it's a huge adjustment to go from being a podcaster to being the deputy director of the FBI. The FBI often calls for public assistance or in matters of great public concern will announce an investigation to reassure the public. This seems much more narrowly targeted, maybe to a former podcast audience.
The spat between FBI directors escalated earlier in the week when Comey claimed Patel is ill-prepared for the role, adding that he feels, quote, sorry for the guy. Quite a fiery discussion one way or another here. I understand on one level why James Comey irritates some people. I do get that he can be kind of sanctimonious at times. Having said all that, I mean, you would probably be able to guess at my feelings about Kash Patel and Dan Bongino in their senior roles at the FBI. Kash Patel having published that book that included a sort of deep state enemies list. Dan Bongino famously having declared at one point in 2018 or 2019 that his entire life was about owning the libs. I don't think these guys are appropriate people atop the FBI. And just briefly, Amber, I do want to push back on what Patel said, because the whole conduct of the FBI around the Russia investigation has become such a hot button issue. It was investigated during the first Trump term by the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, Michael Horowitz, and of course by John Durham as well. And Horowitz, the Inspector General at that time, found that the FBI, quote, had an authorized purpose in opening Crossfire Hurricane and did not find evidence that, quote, political bias or improper motivation was behind the decision to open it. So Kash Patel can say whatever he likes. He's a fairly inflammatory figure at the best of times, but we have to have some kind of fidelity to the historical record.
Well, we do know, though, that even if the Inspector General said that there was a reason to open Crossfire Hurricane, that there was tons of FBI misconduct in the actual investigation itself, including an FBI agent lying on a federal forum in order to get a FISA warrant to spy on Carter Page, including Justice Department official Nellie Orr allegedly lying to Congress, which a new document this week just showed. You also had the FBI using circular confirmation of public reports of the Steele dossier in order to verify the Steele dossier, meaning Christopher Steele would leak information to news reporters, and then the FBI would take those articles and say, well, look, the media reported on it, even though they were tipped off by Christopher Steele, so that means that the Steele dossier has credibility.
But let me just get in for a second, because you said there was tons of FBI misconduct. When Durham looked into it at the Trump administration's behest, he brought 3 indictments, 2 people were acquitted, and the one person, the person that you're alluding to, was ended up with a probationary sentence because he had doctored an email relating to Carter Page and the inquiry there. The reason I believe that people like Horowitz say there was legitimate reason to open the investigation in the first place, because there was, in fact, lots of genuine reason, getting back to the whole conversation with the Australian diplomat in London, all of these things that were raising genuine concerns. Now, that is why people working during the time of the Trump administration believed that there was legitimate reason to open the investigation.
Well, the Australian diplomat conversation you're referring to actually turned out was very much misrepresented when it was presented to the FBI as the Trump transition team official asking for Hillary Clinton compromat, when really it was the other way around. So I think that has been taken out of context.
It was the Trump administration official saying that he had heard that there was such material available.
Yeah, but not asking for it, and not...
No, but the Australian diplomat said, I was going to swear there. The Australian diplomat said basically, goodness me, this rival campaign believes the Russians have stuff on Hillary Clinton, right? So that obviously caused concern on the part of the Australian diplomat, otherwise he would never have reported it.
That's the reason to open up an FBI investigation, because someone said, I heard that the Russians had info on Hillary?
Well, I think that it is. I mean, obviously it was considered among the reasons that were to open up that legitimate investigation. That's why it was still, why the Inspector General, among others, believed that it was valid.
Isn't that kind of a circular argument, though? Well,
really.
This went to the FBI, and the FBI decided that it was important, so they decided they had to open up the investigation. But when you actually look at the material yourself and say, well, it's because they said that they had heard something about Hillary Clinton and opposition research, like...
No, I don't. Well, we just disagree. I mean, I think that it is absolutely valid to have done what they did.
Let's go into this point that Comey was making about what Kash Patel and Dan Bongino want to investigate at the FBI, including, quote, potential public corruption, including cocaine found at the White House, the pipe bomb placed near the DNC and RNC headquarters ahead of J6, and the leaked drafts of the Supreme Court Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. I find all of these to be fairly reasonable things to investigate. What are your feelings on that?
It depends which ones we're talking about. The one that I think is most legitimate to investigate is the SCOTUS leak, actually. I think that seemed, just a peculiar thing that gets leaked before the decision is actually delivered. In relation to the pipe bombs outside the DNC and the RNC, the problem I have with that one isn't at all the investigation of them. It's that there's no evidence that the investigation was ever closed. So I'm not really sure what they're reopening. the understanding is that the perpetrator of those attempted attacks hasn't been caught, and the investigation remains open. Now, in relation, the one I've biggest problems with is the baggie of cocaine or whatever amount of cocaine was found at the Biden White House. I don't see really at this point what the importance of that is, what would be proven by identifying who it came from or who possessed it. I assume, frankly, the reason is to keep in the headlines cocaine at the Biden White House and perhaps to try to link it to Hunter Biden in some way. But the idea that that is a pressing issue for the nation, I find that pretty ludicrous.
I want to know who brought the cocaine in, especially considering the Secret Service said that they found out who it was, but then weren't going to tell the public who it was. I mean, that feels like a cover-up to me.
I don't, if they found out who it was, they should present the evidence
Yeah,
the
or
way
they
it
had
was.
an
I don't
idea
think
at
that they
least.
should have an innuendo like that. I don't believe they ever definitively said they knew who it was, but if people want to correct the record in that way, by all means. The point about it is there was some cocaine found at the White House. Okay, fine. I mean, people shouldn't be using illegal drugs. But like the idea that this involves or requires some new FBI investigation. The New York Times, as we were discussing earlier, is out with a story today talking about drug use on Elon Musk's part. Are we going to set the FBI on that? Presumably Dan Bongino and Kash Patel are not going to.
Well, it is a little bit different having a baggie of cocaine just outside of the Oval Office than someone out in, private land, right?
Well, I don't actually think it is, Amber, because look, we don't know where the cocaine came from in the White House. In Elon Musk's case, we're talking about somebody who was serving via his Doge role in a very central position in the current administration. So we're not investigating some minor historical detail, as I would see the cocaine in the Biden White House thing. We would then be investigating the behavior of someone who remains influential in a current administration.
But can we say that if we don't know who the cocaine belonged to? What if it was a top advisor to Joe Biden? What if it was Joe Biden himself? We literally have no idea.
But let's say, for example, it was a senior advisor to Joe Biden, and we then uncovered that. I mean, then that person would be guilty of a drug offense.
Yeah,
But
sure.
what's the broader significance?
Well, is it not significant that someone who is advising the President of the United States on perhaps very sensitive or secure matters could have been under the influence of an illegal drug?
Well, do you think that's true of Elon Musk?
I would absolutely condemn Elon Musk if it was confirmed that he was under the influence of hard drugs.
So do you think the FBI should investigate the New York Times story?
Well, we have, 2 anonymous sources and no indication that he actually took drugs. I mean, if they have something stronger than that, sure. I mean, in this case, there's literally a physical baggie and a cubby outside of the Oval Office.
That seems, with respect, a slightly more lax standard about Elon Musk than you're imposing on an administration that's now out of office.
I could tell the Daily Caller to publish a story saying that I heard that Niall Stanage was taking cocaine before he sat on the set of Rising. I don't think that should amount to an FBI investigation.
No, I don't think it should either, but that's because I'd probably sue you for defamation if you did that, and then we'd be in a whole other category. But look, I think, the Supreme Court issue, you can, the leak regarding Dobbs, I do think that was a serious thing. And I think that you could argue for that being investigated. The cocaine thing, I obviously don't. What was the other one that I've now forgotten? The pipe bomber. Yeah, I mean, I don't believe that's a closed investigation, but we should certainly find out who it is. Meanwhile, a CNN host has some strong words for the Democratic Party. We'll tell you more about that next.
The Democratic Party is still figuring out its way forward to win back voters. While the Democratic consulting class is pitching ideas behind closed doors, mainstream media is openly warning them. Here is CNN's Abby Phillip, strong advice to Dems. Let's watch.
They're going to have to get rid of some sacred cows, okay? Yep. This is going to be the hard part. Everybody talks about authenticity until the rubber meets the road and they have to actually take positions that the activist, consultant class base does not want them to take.
I don't think they will.
Some Democrats have slammed their party's initiatives aimed at winning back men. One of these initiatives is called Operation Sam. It is a $20 million effort that will include studying language and content that goes viral in male-dominated spaces. and also buying ads in video games. James Carville told The Bulwark in a recent interview, people lose sight of the fact that politics is by and large a candidate-driven enterprise. But it is a democratic article of faith that enough expertise and enough dollars can solve any problem, up to and including authenticity.
Andrew Yang, who ran an unsuccessful campaign for the 2020 Democratic primary nomination, told The Bulwark, the Democrats don't have a messaging problem so much as a leadership problem. Who speaks for the Democratic Party? No one knows. They can't resolve that, so they do what they know how to do. Spend money on consultants.
Plenty to discuss there, Amber. Let me firstly do a rare thing on Rising, which is praise someone at CNN. I thought that Abby Phillip made an excellent point there, actually, which was that there is this tendency to talk in these very nebulous terms. Oh, we have to be authentic, we have to connect with people. And then, do people really want that? Because authenticity often requires making people uncomfortable or saying things that are not sort of focus group approved. And I thought she made a really valid point there, that if you follow through on that, you are going to get in, you're going to propose things that at least make some elements of the Democratic coalition uncomfortable.
Also, if you're doing an $20 million anthropological study of American men, and then you pull some tidbits from that study and start speaking authentically, are you really being authentic?
Right.
No, obviously not.
I have studied the syntax of men, and I've decided I'm going to adopt it.
It literally sounds like an alien spaceship, like landed in the U.S. and said, if we are to win, we have to get American man. How do they speak?
Well, it is the equivalent. I mean, I remember, this is going back a long time now, but it was when Hillary Clinton was running, I think when she was running against Obama, in the Democratic primary, she gave a speech to a black audience where, like, she dropped the G off every word, and it was so...
We ain't no ways tired.
It was so bad. Yeah. And so you do get into that sort of thing of, it's just like, oh, that's kind of crazy.
I also find it interesting that the name of the project is Speaking to American Men, when it should be Listening to American Men. And I think that is one of the fundamental problems with the modern Democratic Party, which is, well, it's not that our policies are not accepted by the voters. It's not that we have a branding problem or a leadership problem. It's that we don't massage the message the right way so the voters understand what we're really selling. And it is a kind of way of infantilizing and discrediting, I think, the intelligence of voters and their ability to figure out through your ads, campaigns, and your messaging what it is you actually want to do. Maybe you should actually speak to the voters and hear what they want from the Democratic Party instead of sort of foisting on this top-down model.
Yeah. Yes, basically. I mean, I do think messaging matters in politics, and I think the way of framing an issue matters. I do take the criticism of the Democratic Party that there are certain issues, you and I have talked about the trans issue, for example, before, where, you know, trans people in sport particularly, I think that is something that the Democratic Party has got out of step with voters on. There are... I've made this point before also, there are economic proposals, increasing the minimum wage, for example, that have fairly significant public support. And so is there a way of framing a message that basically accentuates your strengths and minimizes your weaknesses? I think that is a completely valid political project. I also think that there is a tendency in politics broadly to always sort of overstate the extent to which the nation has swung one way or swung the other. Donald Trump did win the popular vote for the first time of his 3 elections this time around. He prevailed in the popular vote by about 1.5 percentage points. It was enough to win the Electoral College. That is seen by most Democrats and liberals as a cataclysm. But, you know, I remember when George W. Bush won re-election and Democrats thought they were, you know, finished forever. I remember when Obama won re-election and there was this idea that the emerging Democratic majority was going to ensure Democratic wins in perpetuity. We're in fact a very finely divided nation, and, you know, Kamala Harris still got many, many millions of votes, and it's not, I don't think that the evidence really suggests there is this absolutely cataclysmic, we must throw everything out, otherwise we'll never get elected again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that going into the midterms, the Democrats have a stronger hand than the Republicans, despite all of the infighting. But what is more interesting to me in terms of the reason we're talking about this as a sort of cataclysmic change is the issue breakdown. Not even the Trump versus Kamala breakdown, but the breakdown on immigration, economy, crime, gender issues, even just cultural issues like freedom of speech or thought policing or language policing, things of that nature that are maybe not as easily identifiable in a poll, but clearly, especially among American men, they have great distaste for. So until the Democratic Party is willing to take the 80% side of an 80-20 issue, I just don't see how a weaselly messaging campaign gets them over that hump.
Yeah, I mean, you're using terms like weaselly. I don't think there's anything particularly weaselly about the message that Bernie Sanders and AOC have been putting out, for example, in those rallies. I would argue that that is a strong message. It is often, incidentally, a message that includes some criticism of the Democratic Party. What did you say?
Yeah, I'm referring more to like David Hogg.
You're not a big David Hogg fan.
No, not really.
I mean, you think he's weaselly in what way, though?
I think that he's weaselly in that he has long been sort of emblematic of the type of thing that American men find very distasteful, which is like the DNC operative who wants to take guns and is quite feminine, really, doesn't show much masculinity, and supports a lot of the progressive Democratic policies, but then when he's tasked with changing the Democratic Party and being a young voice, all of a sudden now he's on Bill Maher talking about how he's going to win over men.
I think a lot of the opinions on David Hogg just fundamentally break down on partisan lines. I don't agree with everything he says, but I think he's a much more effective media communicator than you do. I think there's an argument about what exactly he's trying to accomplish with the threat of primarying people. He talks about a new wave of Democratic leaders, but he's also kind of nice about some very old Democratic leaders as well. So I think there's an element of strategic confusion. But you raise the issue of gun control, for example. There are, as you're well aware, widespread public support for things like universal background checks. And there are significant proportions of the country who do in fact believe that the gun control laws are too lax. So I don't see that. I think that's an issue that in my 20 plus years in the US has flipped to some extent. That it used to be a very strong Republican issue, and I don't think the data suggests it is.
Well,
anymore.
they certainly don't agree with David Hogg, though, on issues like mandatory gun buyback programs or banning AR-15s or other semi-automatic rifles. And so he goes so far beyond those issues that do have popular support on the Second Amendment and turns it into gun-grabbing programs and getting rid of the most popular rifle to ever be sold in the United States.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that the fundamental point is it being for stricter gun control, is that politically a bad or good thing? It's a good thing so long as you don't stumble over into the into the elements of that are less popular. There's a large slab of public support for stricter laws than we have at the moment.
But David Hogg has gone over that, stumbled over that hill that you're identifying. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Do we have anything else on the matter, Amber?
I think we're good.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I count me skeptical as the Dems winning back American men, but we shall see.
The pendulum shall swing in the end, Amber.
It usually does. So. That's going to do it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.